welcome to Counterpunch Radio. My name's Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in, for coming back. First-time listeners, thank you so much for finding the show. Always appreciated that we're hopefully continuing to grow the audience, continuing to grow this show. I'm trying to be consistent, but it's hard. Life sometimes gets in the way, but hopefully we are on a regular schedule again and getting to these weekly episodes, or as weekly as I can make them. I do really appreciate hearing from people in the audience. You can always feel free to email either Counterpunch, or you could email me directly, my first and last name at gmail.com. Always appreciate it either on Twitter or Facebook, any way that you want to. Always happy to interact with the audience. Now, of course, I do my usual song and dance for Counterpunch because I think Counterpunch is important, and I think it's important to support it. I am a supporter, I have to say. Well, before I had this podcast, I was a supporter of Counterpunch. I have a subscription to the magazine as well. It's a great way to support Counterpunch, to continue that website. I know it's a go-to for me every morning. I'm sure it is for a lot of you guys. You could use the PayPal feature. You could pick up the phone and make a donation via phone by calling Becky in the Counterpunch office, or you could get a subscription to the magazine. That's also a very good way of supporting Counterpunch, particularly now, particularly given what's happening in the left alternative media space, because even some of those trusted sources, I think, in some ways are less trusted now. And, let's put it this way. There's a lot of distrust in our alternative media landscape for various reasons. And I think Counterpunch is a trusted source, particularly on issues of war and peace, and on issues of social justice and environmental justice and things of that nature. So hopefully you agree with me, and hopefully that's why you're listening to this show. Also, because you love the sound of my voice. It is the dulcet tones that bring you back. All right. Let me turn to my guest today. I'm very happy to have Rob Larson on the show. Rob is first and foremost an economist and an author. He has a very important book that he wrote just a few years ago called Bleakonomics. He is teaching at Tacoma Community College in Washington State, and most importantly for our purposes today, he is the author of a brand new book, which I could not possibly recommend more highly, Capitalism versus Freedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom. And if that title and subtitle sounds familiar, it should, because it is a reference to a seminal work in let's call it the right-wing, neoliberal wing of capitalism. But we'll get into all of that. Rob Larson is on the show today. Rob, welcome to Counterpunch Radio.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Now, I kind of did it in the intro, sort of introduced a little bit of what we're going to be talking about. But since we're kind of beginning at a very general level, talk to me about this book. By the way, congratulations on the book. I think it's a very important work. It's very timely and an important contribution to the conversation about capitalism and about neoliberalism and the right wing. So let's begin with a general overview, if we could. Talk to me about Capitalism versus Freedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom. What is the general premise of this book, and what drove you to write it now?
Right on. Thanks, Eric. The book comes from the experience you have when you want to argue about the economic system with young people, or especially anybody who's more conservative or libertarian. Very quickly, if you get into it, they'll get to where they're telling you to read a couple of particular books that are really, highly regarded on the right. And frequently it's one of these pair of books, right? So, one of them is Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, his 1960s book that became a lot of the basis for his Reaganite advice to that administration. And then, of course, also The Road to Serfdom, Hayek's book. And so my book has a title and subtitle purposefully opening the book by making fun of them and trying to subvert their arguments. The premise of the book is that traditionally, we have in the West sort of a couple related concepts of freedom and liberty, that we regard very highly, of course, because freedom is such a crucial part of human life. It's the ability to do what you want and be with whom you want in your life, and to become who you want to become. So we care about it a lot, obviously. And so in the West, we have a couple concepts of freedom. And the short version you'll get from these books is that capitalism and markets help us to fulfill our freedom and give us the fullest scope, basically, to explore and to develop our freedom relative to other economic systems. The premise of my book is, if you really dig into this and think about these concepts, capitalism doesn't satisfy any of our ideas of freedom.
Well, I certainly agree with you there, but let's dig into that a little bit further because you just mentioned the word, and I think it's obviously central to the entire issue that you're discussing, the word being freedom. And one of the interesting things that kind of weaves this book together is this idea of different kinds of freedom, not necessarily competing, although I guess in a sense they are, but distinctly different and yet interrelated concepts of freedom, one of them being freedom from, and the other being freedom to. And I'd like if you could explain for the audience a little bit these two different concepts, how they're similar, how they're different, and why it was important to define it in those terms for your book.
Yeah, so obviously this is a major human concept that people think about a lot. So there's what you discover if you look into it is there's a number of sort of schools and different aspects to the idea of liberty that people sort of delineate in different ways. One very prevalent way of thinking about the subject was developed to sort of create a broad distinction in concepts of freedom. And the basic version is we call these positive and negative forms of freedom, developed by the famous philosopher Berlin. So if you look on the one hand, we would suggest, or they suggest there's a concept of freedom that they call negative freedom. And that's often the one that's most commonly thought of. It means freedom from, like freedom from the coercion of other people or institutions or something. So if you are able to avoid being subject to powerful institutions that can push you around or tell you what to do, if you can avoid that, we say that you have more negative freedom. Right? On the other hand, they also delineate this concept of positive freedom or positive liberty, which is about being free to do different things, like the freedom to, for example, consume some of society's economic production, the freedom to speak and articulate your views in different ways. And I should say, like, there's a lot of subtlety to those basic pictures there, and a lot of philosophers on the right and on the left politically take different views about them, and some of them don't think that much of this distinction particularly. But I think it's a handy one, especially because if we look at its relevance to economics, what we see is that more conservative economists and more conservative philosophers will say negative freedom is the one we want because it keeps us free from institutions, mainly government in their analysis, from telling you what to do. So if you get your taxes cut or your coal company gets deregulated, that's more negative freedom for you because it's reduced the government's ability to make you pay taxes or not dump waste somewhere. Alternatively, they would view positive freedom as kind of being in excess. Like now you're saying that everyone has the right to do different things, like the right to consume some of society's production, and they consider that they think that would involve too much authoritarian government or inevitable encroachment on other areas of freedom. And for those reasons, they're usually more antagonistic to positive freedom in these kind of parameters. And so in Milton Friedman's book, he sort of takes freedom to mainly mean negative freedom, and he explores how capitalism keeps you free from the power of big institutions, which of course is the stupidest argument ever. So in my view, the conservatives, yes, they accept that capitalism doesn't provide positive freedom in most circumstances, but it does provide negative. My book's argument is it doesn't provide either because we're subject to big corporate and capitalist power plays all the time.
Absolutely. And one of the other things I think that comes through as you kind of walk through some of these arguments or some of these ideas is the fact that, well, of course capitalists would be inclined towards negative freedom, right? Because negative freedom really kind of builds and legitimizes and buttresses their power and the power of capital, whereas positive freedom in some senses restrains that, doesn't it?
Yeah, at least relative to that government policy action. And that usually is, the default. When they say you're free from outside coercion, the government forces you to pay taxes. And even when they concede that there are public goods, and of course Friedman turns to national defense because he's some Reaganite, it's the public good that he will accept. He says, yes, we have a republic even, so we have something to say about what governments do and what they choose as far as policy and what resources to put into those policies. But once the government decides, even as a republic, we all have to accept that. Whereas in the market, I can get my kind of pants I like and you can get the kind of pants you like. And it's always very facile examples like that. But that is how it's taken. Yeah, like the only authority that they can conceive of is that, yeah, government or public sector.
But surely the arguments from supporters of Friedman and Hayek and Mises and all of the libertarian giants, the argument is that without that coercion from the state or other entities, without that coercion, you have the pure freedom, right? You have the freedom to choose. You could choose to work at a factory A, factory B, or not to work. You have the freedom to send your children to school or not send them to school. I mean, surely that's kind of the ultimate, apex of freedom, isn't it?
Indeed, it sometimes is. That would be a fair characterization. What you discover when you look into how markets evolve over time is that yes, sometimes they are richly competitive, and you are free to choose because you have a variety of options and you have many sources for your local basic retail goods or places to go out and get a bite if you live in a decent sized community. Yes, many markets are competitive and remain that way in the long run, even. However, as anyone with their eyes open can see, of course, often in markets you are not incredibly super free to choose. And there's a number of reasons why, of course, and many of us, who are somewhat more politically left will be familiar with these. There are basic economies of scale that command firms and give them a strong and survival incentive to get big and get profitable, which often means they grow faster than the market and they gain market share and become large, powerful institutions with a lot of influence over markets and price levels and a lot of money to put into shaping people's preferences and so on. Well, there we're very quickly toward models of big corporate oligopoly and getting pretty far away from this nice, reassuring free to choose, which again applies in some circumstances, but it's just childish. I mean, if you learn anything about microeconomics, you learn that markets evolve in all kinds of directions because of the diversity of things that we make. Some things are utilities like electric power and water, which must come all the way to you through this huge, expensive infrastructure grid. And so they end up being natural monopolies. And of course, conservatives are willing to allow patent monopolies for people or institutions that have paid for research, which creates monopoly, of course. And other times you have these network monopolies, which is the case with our Silicon Valley firms. They mostly owe their huge growth to network effects, as we call it in economics, where their service gains value as more people use it. All of these things drive markets very strongly to, these days, oligopoly, because full monopoly is often legally challenging. Not to say it can't be done, but there are obstacles. Before we regulated this at all, like back in the late 19th century, the Gilded Age, Rockefeller and Carnegie, capitalism was just monopolies in any kind of large significant industry. Oil, steel, cigarettes, the Wall Street cartel under Morgan. So Friedman can blithely insist, as he does in these books, that markets are competitive, cite a few examples that favor that, and then it's hand-waving, and he just blandly says private monopoly is not very important. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Hayek, in his book, for his part, in Road to Serfdom, he says that concentration is as I recall, it's a Marxist doctrine, I believe is what he says. Like, that may be true, Hayek, but it's still a fact.
Oh, it's interesting you bring up Hayek, and I already mentioned Mises. These are the Austrian economists who kind of lend the name to the so-called Austrian School of Economics, which is highly influential on Milton Friedman and others. And you mentioned Marx and kind of Hayek saying his ideas in opposition to Marx. I think it's important to have a little bit of historical context here. Hayek is operating at a time when Marxism, Marxist thought, and socialism is very much ascendant, when his type of views, the far-right economic views, which were in many ways kind of backed by the moneyed interests of Europe, including the royal houses and others, that they were very marginal. They were extremist and kind of seen as really kind of outlandish. Can you talk a little bit about the way in which Marx and socialism and socialist thought really kind of shaped and forced a reaction from Hayek and these other right-wing economists?
That's interesting. And yeah, of course, that's always a major part of intellectual history. Is so much, we think of ourselves as being like scientists in the social sciences. and developing these ideas because they have their own logic and they're so compelling. But it seems like so often it's a reaction to what's happening politically at the time, like a lot. And of course, yeah, exactly back when Hayek was writing in the early 20th century, that's at a time when absolutely social democrat, nominally socialist political parties were, very ascendant, and certainly including Germany, like the greatest domestic economy, and France and the Labour Party in Britain. And so very much the right felt it's under attack, and it's really never stopped feeling under attack, even in times like this when it's utterly dominant. So that's definitely a part of that story. And it's interesting, too, when you dig into this, I discussed this a little bit in chapter 3 of the book, just the history of these characters when they were in the political wilderness and out of power, like in the New Deal period, in the early Cold War era in Europe before the, as it were, neoliberal turn. In that era, like, they survived because of support from wealthy, but now more heavily taxed by the New Deal and the outrageous European welfare state. Like, they survived because of support from more conservative, big, wealthy families and wealthy individuals who funded the Mount Parallel Society and these related bodies and the research of fellow travelers. It's interesting enough, yeah. Like most of my book is focused on just these ideas and letting the right have space to make their arguments. I feel like no one lets the other side talk, so we let them come in and have their paragraphs, and then we look at why the arguments completely fall apart. So it is more of a somewhat intellectual approach, but that history is fascinating.
Absolutely. And the reason I bring up the history is because it really does relate to a lot of the things that people on the left talk about throughout the 20th century, whether you want to talk about the importation of Friedmanite policies and how that impacted U.S. foreign policy in Latin America and places like Chile and elsewhere, which were seen as a laboratory for a lot of these ideas, right? You see Latin American dictatorships kind of following a lot of these models. Much of the history of the 20th century, and certainly of the post-war 20th century, is the history of the implementation of a lot of these ideas.
Indeed. That's exactly right. And people, of course, like to use the phrase or the term neoliberalism for this, most recent era in economic history and policy. And people like to argue about whether that term is useful or if it's lost meaning and so on. I mean, I think it has a basic utility. But one thing I enjoy, I think I mentioned this comes up early in the book, is a little bit before the great financial crisis that we had almost 10 years ago now. William F. Buckley, the dean of conservative intellectuals of that era, wrote this article celebrating Milton Friedman, and he specifically says in this article that the period since Reagan's election, basically since 1980, he calls it the age of Friedman economically. And I think that's really useful. Like, that speaks to so much about what the neoliberal era is. Like, it's the era where policy is shaped by Friedman and Hayek and their acolytes and the people further to the right, who we also look at. But that's useful because I think, neoliberalism, sure, because it describes such a broad set of social changes, you can make a legitimate point that it's lost some of its original, investment and policy-based meaning. But when you look at it as the age of the policies of Milton Friedman, which he happily describes as cutting taxes and deregulation and so on, it becomes a lot more specific. And I think that's, in part at least, a useful way to think of the period.
Well, there's no doubt. And the other aspect that I think is important in all of this is the fact that neoliberalism it has this kind of cachet as if it's, the epitome of economic freedom on a macro scale. But again, if you dig into it, all of the policies that we associate with neoliberalism and with neoliberal economics, they're heavily dependent upon the state. They're heavily dependent upon state power to be able to enforce certain principles and to prevent certain aspects from entering the market or affecting the markets and so forth. Can you talk about, for lack of a better word, the hypocrisy or, the sort of myopic view that a lot of the neoliberal worshipers take about the role of the state?
Yeah, that's interesting because, of course, there is a range of views within, of course, the right and conservatives or libertarian thought. And some of them are more hypocritical and some of them are more like consistent. And I think that there's a lot to be seen there. So exactly, like figures like the ones who I'm mainly focused on, like Friedman and Hayek, the ones who had the most sort of intellectual and policy impact, cited by conservative heads of state, like Hayek got celebrated by Thatcher and Ronald Reagan recorded an introduction video clip for Milton Friedman's PBS special in which he misstates that Friedman has gotten the Nobel Peace Prize, which is incorrect. So obviously, I kind of focus on them because they had the most impact. But I do like to talk also about sometimes they would say further to the right, the more consistent, or maybe you could say purist libertarian figures like von Mises and Rothbard of the Austrian school themselves. So there's that variety there. Your question is, yeah, absolutely. Friedman and Hayek, I mean, they're quite willing. They very quickly rationalize the biggest source of government waste, which is the military and intelligence state. They pass that over in less than sentences, in just a few words. But Social Security, oh, that's bankrupting us. So that fairly naked right-wing hypocrisy and just having a policy-based set of intellectual conclusions, that's what I refer to in the book several times looking at these guys. I think you can't conclude anything but that they're opportunists. They're looking, this is an argument we can make because this looks bad. Or here, this sounds reasonable unless you think about it much. Like they're looking for opportunities to score points a lot with a popular audience rather than actually have a logic or be anywhere near the facts. But there is, some more purist strains, especially among libertarians themselves. I'm sure you have a few listening. Hi, guys. And what you see there is, they are thinking about this, and they take this issue seriously, and they'll say, we may value the contributions made to policy change by Friedman and Hayek, but they make a lot of concessions to having government and accepting public goods as something that the authoritarian state should provide. Because, again, people are too myopic to see the possibility of authoritarian corporations that have less accountability than the government does. And now we're handing them so much power with privatization. But if you look at these figures, like these are the ones like Ayn Rand, to take someone who's prominent, said we should have private roads for all purposes. Like the interstates should be privately owned, even though, of course, our railroads are privately owned and were deregulated in the 80s. And now we have 4 giant regional monopolists running that industry. And I would expect something like that for the interstate system. It's how the cable networks work up also. So they're willing to accept that because of that, like you said, myopia. Then Rothbard, in particular, is one who's really celebrated on the sort of real libertarian sectors of popular opinion. He's considered to have a lot more integrity, and he doesn't make compromises with statists and accept any kind of government. And he's all about toll roads and these kind of things. It's a very arch conservative worldview, and it has really no relevance to making actual policy because, in fact, markets need government to operate. It's true. Like with nothing else, they need a stable court system to enforce property rights and contract claims. Capitalists, that's the thing they want more than anything else. And Rothbard says, we'll have private courts and people will go to the ones that they like the best. It's just completely fatuous.
Indeed, and I want to return to Rothbard and what I guess we could call anarcho-capitalism in a little bit. But before we do that, I just want to finish up the point about, and I don't want to say hypocrisy, but trying to understand from the perspective of Friedman and Hayek and people like that, the way that it's rationalized, the need for the state, because there is a clear and quite compelling argument for why the state and the power of the state is necessary in order to execute their economic agenda. And that is, and this has been seen historically, because it is deeply unpopular. Because it is deeply hated by the majority of people who are negatively impacted by it. Obviously, the wealthy love it, but the majority of people aren't wealthy, and the majority of people hate it because it's a direct attack on their very survival. And we saw this over and over again with dictatorships in Latin America. And so a lot of the economic agenda that they put forward, it requires a strong authoritarian, if not fully dictatorial government just to implement it.
Indeed. And that's very, very much clearly the historical global record. Yeah. If you look at what's happening in Brazil, or Turkey, I mean, any country you want to look at around the world, it's elite corporate and state elements pushing their neoliberal program. And that means privatizing services, cutting taxes, sure. But a lot of working people pay fairly modest taxes, especially in countries like the United States. And their tax reductions are far more modest, of course. And so what it ends up being is they get very small additions to their after-tax income, but now they're responsible for getting all these additional services in the market where they're produced by some borderline monopolist with a lot of pricing power, and they're just utterly priced out of the market. I mean, this is why so many people can't get health insurance in the U.S. and why charter schools are scary to so many people. Like, you're right. Like, there is that fear there because people realize, like, how will I get that on my own? People have enough, the man on the streets, in regular families, they have enough of an idea of what their basic economic conditions are to know if that's not provided to us through some state, via our common tax collections, we'll never afford that on our own. So these policies are unpopular. Now, I tend to focus on the United States because, of course, that's where I'm from, and also because we are the country stopping change. It's been certainly our role since the Second World War, right? Is any time a regime or a country wants to go through some big transition to socialism or anything else, all we can do is demonize it to kingdom come, build up a big aid relationship with the military, and run a coup, or occasionally invade it directly. And so I tend to focus on the U.S. with this stuff in the framework that I discuss the issues in, because I always feel like, sadly, to the world's misfortune probably, but we are the keystone. Like, we have to develop a change and a willingness to accept non-neoliberal structures, or the world's never going to be able to.
Absolutely. And in the United States, just like in many other parts of the world, there is an almost an implicit recognition from regular people that they have economic rights. But the reality is that the economic system that is dominant doesn't really recognize those rights, or to the extent that it does, it really kind of recognizes only the most minimal of rights. So when you have people, whether it's in the United States or in a developed European country or a less developed country in the global South, those people are going to react when their economic rights begin to be stripped away. And they may not frame it in those terms, but certainly when you see an attack on pension programs, when you see, a move to privatize and obviously consequently raise the price of electricity or water or things. I mean, we could point to 1,000 examples throughout the global South where this has happened. People react to that. It forces a kind of social movement, social change, and it requires a dictatorship or an authoritarian government to prevent that from toppling this right-wing economic system.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that pattern, we see that so reliably. And it usually originates because, like you said, foreign citizens are often a lot more resistant to having their basic public sector, public goods, and what remnants of positive freedom that they have, they're resistant to having it stripped away. Maybe they're not as easily persuaded as Americans.
Yeah, and the strange thing is Americans, they also feel that way. I mean, you look at the polls, 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 people believe in Social Security and in maintaining and protecting Social Security, if not expanding it. They believe that people should be provided with health care, affordable health care. I mean, all of these things that you would call, quote unquote, progressive policies, most people in the United States actually support them. It's let's say, the ideological window dressing around it that really, I think, kind of dissuades people from recognizing their own economic rights. And I think that is obviously deliberate by people like Friedman and their followers and descendants.
Indeed. Yeah, if you look at policy issues, I mean, on a lot of subjects, this public opinion is way hilariously to the left of the political parties and certainly the national, commercial media. And it's amazing how that's kind of stayed that way. I remember many years ago first getting interested in these issues and going, wow, there's a lot of support for public programs like Medicare and Social Security, the minimum wage, basic environmental and public health laws. Okay, those are very popular. And we've been slashing away at them ever since and constantly propagandizing against them on media. They remain pretty popular. Like, the polls, the numbers move, but I mean, not like hugely. Like, it's interesting how the United States has remained, despite decades of arch capitalist propaganda and government, it's remained a social democratic citizenry. I don't really understand it myself.
Yeah, it's a kind of an interesting phenomenon, and I'm going to return to that in the second half of our conversation because I want to relate it to some of our current political developments, but there's a lot more to talk about on the other side of the break, including media and how the media apparatus really fits into the framework of, not only neoliberalism and neoliberal capitalism, but in what you've written in this book. So I want to talk about media, I want to talk about the future, and I want to talk about our current political situation. A lot more to discuss with Rob Larson. You're listening to Counterpunch Radio. Come back after the break and we'll continue.
socialism and what it really means. It's equal rights for every man, regardless of his strength. So don't let no one fool you. Joshua said, listen as I tell you. Joshua said, no man are better than none. Socialism is love between man and man. Socialism is
love for your brother.
Socialism is
linking hearts and hands.
Would you believe me? Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is
sharing with your sister.
Socialism is
people pulling together.
Would you believe me? Love and togetherness. That's what it means. Mr. Bigger trembling in his shoes, saying he's got a lot to lose. Don't want to hear about sufferer at all.
Joshua said,
one man have too many, while too many have too little. Socialism don't stand for that, don't stand for that at all. Socialism is
love for your brother.
Socialism is
linking hearts and hands.
Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is
sharing with your sister.
Socialism is
people pulling together.
Would you believe me? Love and togetherness. That's what it means. Socialism is
love for your brother.
Socialism is
linking hearts and hands.
Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is
sharing with your sister.
Do you believe me?
People pulling together.
Oh,
love and togetherness. That's what it means.
Socialism is
love for your brother.
Socialism is
linking hearts and hands.
Poverty and hunger is what we're fighting. Socialism is
sharing with your sister.
Socialism is
And we're back here on Counterpunch Radio. I'm chatting with Rob Larson. Again, I couldn't possibly recommend the book any more highly. Capitalism versus Freedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom. Very, very important book published by Zero Books. Get yourself a copy pretty much anywhere you can get books, all the usual places. Anyway, Rob, I want to return to where we kind of left off there before the break in talking about, one particular aspect that you've already mentioned, but is really central in all of this, and that's the media. Not only because the media is a way of disseminating a lot of the orthodoxy of right-wing capitalism and anarcho-capitalism, neoliberalism, all these different ideas. It's a way of disseminating it, but it's also, in one sense, a shining example of a lot of these ideas in action. So let's begin there. Can you talk about the evolution of the media landscape in the United States in recent decades and how that is sort of the epitome of a lot of these ideas in action?
Oh, for sure, yeah. And that's a major subject, of course. I mean, anyone can understand how media and information are obviously really crucial to what happens in the world. But in particular, that industry, has gone through such an interesting evolution, and people can't perceive its importance. I mean, just in my own lifetime, just in the last couple of decades, I mean, the commercial media, the TV news networks, the cable networks, the news and entertainment producing companies, they've gone through such a consolidation tsunami. It's, really amazing. Those firms, back in the Bush era, we said by that time they had consolidated through various waves of government deregulation, especially the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which allowed all those different kinds of telecommunications and media firms to start. The idea was they would start competing, but of course what they started doing is started merging, because that's what happens in the real world of capitalism. You get big, you get profitable, you get more bargaining power, and with that market share. Which is something that economists like Friedman and Hayek, who get Nobel prizes, can't even imagine introducing into the conversation. But those are real incentives in the real dirty world of business and commerce. So those firms have gone through such a merger wave. It's amazing. And just lately, just in the last several years, we're seeing this gigantic new phenomenon where the media companies, which by now are these large conglomerates with movie studios and cable content companies and TV networks and huge publishing arms, of course, and periodicals and books. What they're doing now is those giant firms are merging with the telecom firms, the telecommunication companies like Comcast and Charter that provide cable service to your house so you can watch cable TV or get internet that can then go through your Wi-Fi router. And merging also with those cell phone carriers, like AT&T, Verizon, and so on. Now, so these giant media firms are bolting themselves on to these gigantic telecom monopolies for the cable companies and oligopolies for the cell phone firms. So these huge integrated entertainment information complexes. And the justification they all give for it is the rising dominance of the Silicon Valley corporations like Amazon, Google, and Facebook, and so forth. So it's such a perfect epitomizing of why this conservative or libertarian economic view is wrong. Like, power in the market is extremely real, and firms will merge to kingdom come to gain or maintain marketplace bargaining power. So, that to me, if you look at that record at all, and I just briefly look at it in chapter 2 of the book, it's very difficult just to look at those basic business transactions, which are all on the record. No one considers them to be controversial in their details. If you look at those, it's amazing that these guys can continue wielding the beliefs that they've got on the far right.
Well, that was actually my next question. So how do they square this circle? They can't just completely ignore the entire history of the 20th and early 21st century when it comes to the economic evolution of the global system. So how do they square the circle between their beliefs in deregulation, creating choice, and increasing freedom, and the actual record?
You might be surprised at the amount of ignoring that can be done. It's when you're writing your book and you don't have the ethics to quote the other side at length, as I do in my book, it's always, well, the left says this and socialists say this, and of course then it's some hilarious parody of what someone on the left thinks. If you're willing to not quote people at their word, and then you go on news channels where you won't be confronted with opposing questions, let alone articulate opponents of the other side, the amount of ignoring you can do is a lot. So I would at least acknowledge how much there is there. But you're right, like there is some finessing that has to be done. But just the hand waving, it's just so. Like, one thing I like to point out is that Capitalism and Freedom, which I was told to read when I was a young leftist on campus as a young person. That was what the business MBA students I knew would say. Like, read this book, man. You're saying a lot of stuff. You should learn the reality. That book has like 9 footnotes in the whole thing. I think there's like 14 footnotes in the entirety of the book. And several of them are like references to 1 or 2 articles that he's quoting from. And sometimes they're just little explorations on a subject. Free to Choose has a little bit more there. But when you realize reading that book, it's just like a list of demands. He just insists on this and insists on this. And there's no outside evidence. There's no independent reporting. There's no other figures that can corroborate something speaking against interest. It's just a list of demands that are presented to you. So, and in that format, then, there's a point where he says, so how do we keep, Friedman at one point refers to some monopolies, particular to that time in the 60s. He says, how do we deal with these possible abuses of the market? Well, do we want to have a bigger budget for the Federal Trade Commission suing our American companies for being monopolies? No, we should take down trade barriers, because, of course, the Reagan era, and we should globalize the economy and let them compete. And, of course, what's happened since then is global merger waves that are gigantic on a far larger scale. But just with that kind of simple insistence, man. The way these things get rationalized, it's easy if you don't have opponents that you'll have to encounter on Fox or quote.
Well, one of the things that I often encounter, and I will admit, there was a time years and years ago when I encountered a lot of these issues, and I read up on these things. I read Friedman, I read Hayek, I read Ayn Rand, I read Murray Rothbard, and one of the central ideas that I think at least in their minds, justifies a lot of these concepts is the idea of self-preservation. Namely, that when something's privatized, whether it's a road or a school or a river or whatever it may be, that the person who owns it has a vested interest in maintaining it, in expanding it, in growing it, in preserving it, etc. That this idea of self-preservation really is kind of at the heart of a lot of the economic prescriptions that they have, but it's complete and utter bullshit, isn't it?
Yeah, sadly it is. And that's exactly right. Like, that's what the right will say if you bring up the environment to them. They'll say, well, of course, there's some small environmental problems. They're obviously not very scientifically familiar, or they would take the issue more seriously. They'll say, yeah, sure, there are problems in these areas. You know, we pollute streams and so on. That's bad. So if somebody owned that stream, we wouldn't have pollution. If that was owned by someone who had an interest in maintaining it and protecting the resource, then we wouldn't have pollution and externalities, where people can inflict damage on others, because then it would be owned by someone who's interested in it, and they would take legal action or the like. So those are the kind of, exactly, sort of policy suggestions or proposals that you get from people on the farther right, who want to privatize more natural resources. But of course, it's friggin' ludicrous. It's amazing these people can say this with a straight face. The reality is, especially in this era of deregulated finance, people want a short to near-term return on their asset. You can make a couple $1,000,000 on something very quickly, or make some thousands of dollars every year for the rest of your life. As soon as Wall Street or some hedge fund or some investor gets a hold of it, they do whatever they can do very quickly to get money from it and then try to strip themselves of the asset. I mean, it's just amazing to me. If this was true, then you wouldn't have any polluted private property. And that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. That's ridiculous. Do these guys not know what Superfund sites are? The Superfund law, is what the term they use for some 1970s environmental legislation that says if you're a company and you do a huge amount of polluting, it's possible for us to use this law to say, hey, you have to pay some of the costs of cleaning it up. And of course, the taxpayers will carry the rest. And when there's some money in a fund that they call the Superfund sites, like, those are some of the most unbelievably polluted locations on the surface of the earth. Many of them are public property. Many are on private property. They're, mines or harbors that firms were happy to just dump waste into liberally for many decades. It's amazing to me that people can say that stuff with a straight face. But yeah, of course, you'll have an interest in maintaining it until you can make some capitalist profit off it at the end of the quarter to get your stock price up. These guys don't realize how natural resources work and how they can only be exploited a certain limited amount without degrading them each year that you go over that limit. These people are capitalists. They read business magazines and blogs about how smart right-wing people are. They're not reading anything about ecology or what we're learning about how these resources actually, you have to treat them with respect or they collapse like they have through our whole history. The amount of ignoring that these guys do is, my God, that's a book unto itself.
Indeed. Now, the other word that you often come across, among many, but the term that you come across a lot in the justifications for these ideas is efficiency, right? That the market and private capital is simply more efficient than the government. It might be more efficient in building a toll road versus a publicly owned road. It may be more efficient in maintaining a water supply or what have you. Well, A, obviously the record on that indicates otherwise, and B, the very premise of it, I think, is flawed. Can you talk a little bit about efficiency and how efficiency is sort of used or weaponized by those on the right who espouse these ideas?
Oh, man, absolutely. I mean, a lot of bodies are buried in the idea of right-wing efficiency. So, I'd like a lot to take apart there. So when conservatives want to privatize things, which we do constantly, they'll suggest it'll be more efficient on the marketplace. We should realize what that means. I mean, efficient in this context means, it'll cost less. That's within the question if you strip down services and reduce how many trips the bus takes to serve people who are working third shift and increase class sizes for students, the effects of that don't become clear in any economic statistics, or maybe they do far later. So that's a great way to make them more efficient on paper because they cost less because we made them shittier. Like, that's a classic conservative play, of course. But also what efficiency means here, again, is interesting. Like, by this rationale, this is how companies justify. This is how they justify in court when they get sued for merging and becoming oligopolists or monopolists. When these guys want to merge and the Justice Department's antitrust division goes after them and says you shouldn't be allowed to merge, they've got the law now so that they can show it's economically efficient and that it won't lead to necessarily any price increases for consumers. Antitrust law allows for those mergers to go through even if they create larger, more powerful firms. Like market power specifically is not what antitrust is adjudicated on. It's adjudicated on whether this is likely to lead to price increases. So this is why Amazon is allowed to buy anybody, because they are in a stage of their history where they want to increase prices. But it means, yeah, like if two firms merge and they use economies of scale and they lay off one of their human resources departments and so on, like, well, that's efficiency, but also means we're closer to having a giant monopoly again. Like, you don't want Rockefeller to run the economy, like, even if it's incredibly efficient, like, it's also a dictatorship. And that's maybe kind of what you were thinking of, too, for the other part of it, is efficiency is not the only social value we get. Like, access is important. If we make the schools more efficient by making it harder for poor people to get their kids into them, like, great, that's an efficiency gain at the cost of something else that we also value. So it's definitely there is some putting efficiency on a pedestal. Like if a government does something slightly less efficiently than the market does, even on some, on a fully legitimate basis of evaluating that, there may still be reasons for wanting it in the public sector. Maybe that keeps it more under popular control rather than some investors' control. So absolutely, there's that comes up very frequently.
Yeah, and just as you were talking about it, I was just thinking of an example that I've come across just in my life, right? When I was living in Brooklyn, you drive on the BQE, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which has been under construction literally since the end of the 50s, basically. And you look at a lot of these, unionized public employees that are out there working construction, and it looks terribly inefficient. You think to yourself, one can understand why someone would say, well, this is so inefficient. If we didn't have the union there protecting all of these lazy ass workers, then this would get done. But then you think about, okay, so let's assume that were true. What would actually happen? Non-unionized workers would be brought in at much lower wages. They would be forced to be unable to provide for their families in the same way, which would then have a social cost, which would then trickle down and have a knock-on effect on a number of other things, from maybe health services or education or what have you. So these things are all interconnected, and that sort of interconnectedness, I think, is what is obviously and rather consciously ignored by the far right.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's pretty reasonable. And that road crew thing is especially interesting. I'm always amazed how much people are willing to go, oh, look, those road crew workers don't work very hard. They should work harder. And the person saying it to me is always some office worker who gets up 3 times in a day in an air-conditioned setting. Types in a computer. It's like, yeah, they should really work. They don't know what it's like to really work like you do, Candace.
Totally.
Holy cow. So that's interesting. But
Exactly.
Especially, it's amazing how much the United States people have that class consciousness just driven out of them, to the extent that, like they're openly saying, like, other working stiffs like me should be paid less, and those people should be laid off so that the labor market will be looser and more unfavorable to me. It's amazing how little thought people give to that. And again, that's the type of thing that people react to, though, right? Yeah, is they'll see something and go, I understand this. That's inefficient. Well, corporations hide their inefficiency from us by cranking up drug prices so some people can't afford to get it, or pushing up health insurance premiums so people can't afford to get it, or having such invasive privacy standards on social media that some people are too scared to use it. Like, those are real legitimate social inefficiencies too, but that's not stuff that's in front of our faces, and that's not stuff that we're going to be collecting statistical data on any kind of public basis. So there's plenty of inefficiency that they keep out of public eye.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't ever want to talk about the inefficiency of all those who have died, because that certainly makes it more efficient when somebody dies and they no longer cost anything. Now, speaking of people being killed by policies, I think it would be, relevant and important to talk a little bit about the orange beast in the White House currently, and what this means and how it relates to some of these ideas in the book, because There's something rather interesting happening with Trump and the Trump administration, because in some ways, the Trump administration is the perfect embodiment of this sort of right-wing, neoliberal, Friedmanite, deregulate everything kind of mantra. You see that in terms of all of the deregulation of environmental issues, allowing companies to dump chemicals into our streams or to dump waste, into wherever and so forth, and coal plants and all of the rest of that. We see all of this deregulation that's being done by the Trump administration. And so you'd say, well, obviously they're just Friedmanites. And then at the same time, quite literally at the same time, Trump is talking about these tariffs and starting a trade war and protecting U.S. industries and all of this other nonsense, which of course is completely ineffectual and totally absurd the way that he's doing it. But it does raise an interesting question. Do we have almost a kind of a paradoxical or schizophrenic type of ideology in power at the moment?
Well, it definitely doesn't fit neatly into any of the previous slots we've been working with. But this is what happens, politically, is people get weird different varieties of beliefs and they smush them into other things. I mean, this is the United States. Catholics use birth control here. This country lives a la carte and everything it thinks. So that part to me isn't so surprising. But yeah, it is a bizarre regime. It's very far right, and it remains. I mean, it's neoliberal at least halfway. Like, it still loves cutting taxes on the rich, and even more nakedly than before. Like, our middle class tax cuts will be retired after 3 years, but those corporate tax cuts are permanent for the very, very wealthiest part of our society that owns all that corporate stock. So that's pretty, and obviously incredibly aggressive on deregulation, so much so that business doesn't like it. Like, the car industry thinks that Trump is charging so far on cutting fuel efficiency standards that they're going to end up fighting it in court, and that the states are going to end up with different requirements, which is not what the industry wants. So that's aggressively deregulating if you're going faster than even what industry demands. So very far right. But then, starting a trade war. And I mean, people underestimate this. Like, this trade wars, we haven't had these things in my lifetime, certainly, and not in the lifetime of many of your listeners, I'm sure, because of the utterly dominant ascendance of global trade. Certainly after World War II, when the Depression era tariffs come down, and then through the GATT and WTO processes that we're so familiar with, of course, on the left, dealing with the ramifications of them. That's always been part of the neoliberal vision. So what you're seeing with this regime is a only partial comportment, like overdoing some of the neoliberal policies, like the tax cuts and the deregulation, and then walking away from some of the other parts, like the international trade, which again that's core in neoliberalism. That's how you undermine worker bargaining power anywhere, and the ability of governments to collect tax anywhere is to allow companies to just whipsaw one nation against another in terms of where they're going to domicile, let alone invest and actually build a business up or create employment or production. So it's a baffling regime, but because the man at the center of it is such a buffoonish, racist, confessed serial sex assaulter, he just consumes media attention. That's why he was able to win with a lower advertising budget than Clinton. Campaign budget than Clinton was because he got, in the estimation of many, many millions of dollars in free airtime, because people can't stop looking at what horrible, heinous, provocative thing he's done or said today. And many of these things are becoming real human rights violations too. I'm not saying we should try to stop paying attention to what's going on there. The issue with separating children at the border has become a national human rights disgrace, as it should. But also, it's just, there's no oxygen left after idiots talk about that guy. So I'm always eager to try to keep it on policy, because as soon as you start focusing on that new regime, even if, like we're doing, we're focused on the policies, people are, as soon as possible, going over to some goofy hack media take about, well, who knows what he's going to say, or I'm very worried about Russia, and these tiny crumbs of Russian influence. My God, the things we focus on that are so trivial.
Well, and part of the reason we focus on it is not because of their importance, but because it is the dominant narrative put forward by an oligarchy that is our media, as we talked about earlier. I think that if we had actual choice in the media landscape, where we didn't have two or three companies that really dominate the entire landscape and really kind of not only set the agenda, but in many ways write the script that all of the teleprompter readers end up putting into our brains, well, then maybe maybe we wouldn't be focusing on the personalities, and we might have more attention paid to the policies. So that's, I think, a real world translation or product of this ideological, subservience to neoliberal capitalism.
Oh, no doubt. I think, like I said, I think there's a lot of crucial aspects there. And absolutely, that media part of it fits into it crucially here as well.
So before we can close our conversation, I want to talk a little bit about the latter parts of the book, because I think it's really critical that people understand that this is not simply a book that examines ideas and breaks them down so that you can understand them. It then translate those ideas into the impact for the future, which I think is important. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways in which you approached how these ideas impact future generations?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I feel like this is something that people definitely need to pay more attention to. And they are, just in another form. Yeah, so if you look at through our economic history, certainly before capitalism, but definitively since then, our history is environmental destruction. We consume environmental systems that we don't understand, and we use them heavily for whatever human purpose we have. Maybe it's building our civilization up and making important goods and services, or maybe it's to make ships to burn down the neighboring country or something. Whatever purpose, we use those resources aggressively, and our strong history is driving species to extinction, destroying biomes. The legacy of that, from deforesting the Mediterranean to turning East Asia and so much space over to food and rice cultivation, like the legacies of those environmental changes are like fairly enormous, and they're so transformative we don't even realize what the world used to look like before we started building a civilization out of its natural production. So what that means, of course, is that just like we today are not free to look at how, for example, North America, where I am, used to look. We're not free to explore that original habitat except for a few tiny fragments in parks. Likewise, future generations are going to have at this rate, they're going to have a significantly reduced significantly reduced positive freedom to experience the natural world and to encounter the beautiful plant animal species that make up the parts of the biome that we're most enchanted and fascinated with, and that we have our spiritual connections with, and that we use to build up so much of our human understanding and lore and medicine even. Those things are being lost, and there has not been any decrease in the rate of global deforestation and habitat fragmentation overall. So in chapter 4 of my book, I just take up what this means as far as trying to understand markets, our modern economic system, of course, capitalism, and how it is an iteration of this process and what that means for future generations in terms of their freedom and the environment. And I use the year 2100 for my work on this because if you keep up with the scientific literature on this at all, what you see is that scientists, like anyone else, they use simple benchmarks to establish some period of time that they want to try to anticipate what's going to happen in. And so the end of the century is a commonly used benchmark. So I just look at, based on what the scientific literature is saying, looking at scientists and their research now, what are they anticipating will happen to the environment by the year 2100? And again, it's projecting into the future. So these scientists are usually very cautious, conservative in their conclusions people. But take a look at it. I mean, they have a range of conclusions, and they explain what they're based on. They're all pretty rough, from just the IPCC and its anticipation for future temperatures, humidity, and sea level rise. And again, that institution tries to be conservative in its projections, as they say. Those are pretty rough for the end of the year, for the end of the century. And the more recent research, of course, suggests that it's the higher end of the IPCC projections that we're seeing. I guess looking at what's happening with our environmental laws, I suppose people won't wonder. But looking at this means that in the future, I mean, there are going to be so many people in the earth who can't live where their people have always lived anymore on like a large basis. You realize that we don't know what the migration crisis is yet. When people start leaving the areas most expected to be impacted, which, as it happens, are the areas of the world that are already most poor and ravaged by colonialism for centuries, those areas are going to have an outflow of population that's going to be horrible. Like I was reading a paper where some climatologists are anticipating that by 2100, the area around the Persian Gulf will be uninhabitable outdoors during the summer. that is a apocalyptic development. And again, that's a projection. Maybe it'll take a little longer to get there, or maybe it'll happen a little sooner. This is what happens when we're anticipating the future. But who can hear these are scientists who we rely on to fix our heart problems and make planes that carry us around the world in hours. We trust them for everything else. They're saying that in the future, like in the not too distant future, there are people alive now who'll be alive then. They're going to experience this. Like, if that's not a decrease in people's freedom, and if the ability to make this happen, as Rex Tillerson and other energy executives have had that ability, if that's not power over people, I don't know what is.
Absolutely, and it's no joke what you're saying. I mean, I when you say 2100, I have to remind myself, my son will most likely be alive in 2100. I mean, he'll be in his 80s, but he'll be alive. He'll have grandkids by that point. So it's not really that far away.
Indeed, yeah. I have young relatives too. And frankly, what's projected within our own lifetimes isn't quite so pretty at the latter stages either, pal. But just to mention that. But certainly, like our kids, and above all, like the grandkids, of today, like those, it's rough what the scientists think is going to happen. I'm amazed too. I mentioned this in the book, how everyone's suddenly a scientist when it becomes about the environment and climate change. Every young dude, contrarian libertarian, is suddenly, well, I'm a big believer in self-adjusting systems, and I'm skeptical of this climate change. I'm a skeptic. Oh, you're a skeptic suddenly, you little shithead. Suddenly you. Usually some young person, who's just a product absorber their whole lives, wearing clothes and they don't check the label to see where it's from, using a phone that they don't understand even one component out of 200 of, eating food they didn't grow, benefiting from services their parents paid for. And then it's like, well, scientists are saying we may have to change the energy system and tax rich people to do it. We'll have to employ people, though. Scientists, I think you liberals, it's a liberal China hoax. Like, suddenly everyone's a scientist. It drives me a little bit bonkers. Like, I came up in the hard sciences. My undergrad is in biology. And, I mean, it's just an undergrad degree. But it's a valuable education in what ideas are and what counts as an argument and why the sciences basically deliver the goods. I mean, there's a reason that big institutions like militaries and governments and corporations are willing to support the sciences. They're expensive, they're costly. But they do it because science gets the goods, and it can lead to real advantages for an institution to have some cutting-edge scientific research being done. But as soon as it's something inconvenient or that says the free market isn't perfect for eternity at keeping our society great, people suddenly can't hear it. And that is one particular thing that does get under my skin a little bit, because after all, we rely on those guys for everything, those men and women of the sciences, to make our parents pacemakers, to making our super fun smartphones, to making our birth control pills so we can have modern, fun lifestyles. God bless all those things. I'm saying you have to listen to them when they have bad news, too.
Nope. Sorry. We won't
Damn it.
The last thing that I wanted to touch on, and there's so much I wanted to say in response to what you just said, but I'm going to leave that for another time. I want to just close our conversation with the final chapter of the book, which I really think is... in many ways, it's probably could be the most important, and that's envisioning alternatives, and you kind of get into some of this. Obviously, there's probably a lot more ground to cover, and for a whole other book. But can you just give us a little bit of a flavor of that final chapter and envisioning alternatives to this system, and why those alternatives are so important?
Yeah, for sure. So. The last chapter of the book is something I was very happy to write. It's Socialism and Freedom as my final parting shot in the book. Invert the title of Friedman's book there. And yeah, exactly. It's looking at what we can say about different ideas. Because again, just like freedom and liberalism and neoliberalism, socialism as a political term includes a lot. Like, people will put a mild social democrat like Bernie Sanders in that, and the Soviet Union, and libertarian socialists. Like, there's so much space there. You have to be careful and dig into these ideas in some detail. So I look at what we can say about those different socialist traditions and the ideas of freedom, right? Negative freedom from and positive freedom too. And of course, people will say socialism, it's people expect equality as one of the main goals of socialism, which is true. And that's why socialism is so associated with the positive view of freedom. Right? If a child being born in the United States, if we expect that child to have a right to something like a proportionate share of the national income for one human, then that would be a positive freedom view because we see them as having a right to that, right? And this is why the conservative right is so antagonistic to positive freedom, because it means things like redistribution and at least approximate equality of wealth. So that's there. But the big question, of course, is whenever people hear about this, they start thinking, yeah, well, how are you going to avoid some socialist entity, be it a government or whatever? How will you keep them from having power over us? How do we maintain our negative freedom in this process? That's always everyone's fear, is some totalitarian Soviet shit coming out of this. Well, this is where we need to look at what the ideals of socialism really are. And if you look at the history of it, like it's not all, Marxist concepts and so on. Socialism has a long history, and it's interesting. The core idea is always worker control of production. When you go to work, you have access to the information that management usually keeps to itself. And you and your coworkers would sit and make a plan and discuss and figure out what you want to do as far as running the business, what you should produce, what the economy is in need of. And you'll need to work with the other firms or the other production settings that make the inputs for your business or that process your own outputs so people can use them. And you'll need to federate. You'll need to have association. And this is where today's modern telecommunication technology, which is so convenient and is letting you and me have this conversation in reasonable fidelity right now with pretty cheap equipment, at least on my end. That hugely has real potential to enable this kind of workforce active participatory control. Now, of course, it takes a lot of organization to run a whole economy. There are real issues of how we do economic planning and keep that representative, but still allow communities to have some say. So this is usually why figures like me, especially folks who come out of the scientific background, we always recommend an experimental approach. It takes time to figure out how you can balance, the need for responsiveness to the workplace versus the need for some sort of overall, at least industrial level of planning to keep goods and services flowing through production chains so we can all maintain our access to food and electricity and so on. Those are issues that we can't probably just balance with a thought experiment necessarily. You may need to screw around a little bit. Okay, this worked great. This didn't work so well. Like these are how we learn. This is how we learn from social experimentation. Now, of course, whenever in history, whenever a country tries to do something like that, the United States or whichever country is dominant in the region where that is tried comes in and propagandizes against it and terrorizes investors so the money flees the country, build up a relation with the military and overthrow it maybe. It's very difficult to do this without the change starting in those parts of the world that push other countries around, like the United States, Europe, China, like countries like that are big regional hegemonic powers. It kind of has to begin there. And of course, that's a classic sort of Marxist idea of change in the metropole. But that experimental approach and trying to base it on a free federation of workers deciding what happens in their workplace, like that's sort of the conception of socialism that I find is most related to freedom. And I've got a lot of socialist thinkers that I look at in that chapter and look at how they conceptualize these needs for participation and that need for freedom versus other legitimate economic goals like efficiency of production and keeping supply chains going. There's a lot to say about that, but we have a rich tradition of socialist thinkers who are interested in freedom and preserving it and just having a way of producing goods and giving us a reasonable standard of living that we are in control of rather than Jeff Bezos, and which leaves our grandkids looking at a future that they'll be happy about instead of one that's, looking nightmarish right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, although there's plenty more to discuss with Rob. I highly recommend the book, of course, that we've been talking about, Capitalism versus Freedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom from Zero Books. I think it's a really important book, and as I said at the beginning of our conversation, it's really timely because a lot of these ideas, they are being translated into policy and they're being fought out, even within activist communities, right? You do find a lot of this stuff. I saw it at Occupy and I see it today a few years later. So I want to thank Rob for writing the book and for giving us kind of a framework for examining these issues. I would also recommend Rob's previous book, Bleakonomics, definitely worth a read. Follow Rob on Facebook, follow him on Twitter at Ironic Professor. You will find that he tweets and wears corduroy and much more about him on Twitter. Rob, thanks so much for coming on Counterpunch Radio. Really appreciate it. And word to your mother, and word to the mothers of our audience as well. And thank you again, as always, for listening, and I will chat with you again real soon.